Hello and welcome to the Fellowship Phase, an Adventures in Middle-earth podcast. I'm Josh and that's Callum. We're going to give you inside information on how to find your own path through Tolkien's world.
The threat of the shadow weighs upon the hearts of most inhabitants of Middle-earth. There have been 3 ages in the west of the world, and in that time many defeats and many fruitless victories. Sauron, the Dark Lord, seeks to dominate all, but the shadow does not rely solely upon instruments of war. Devious deeds and hidden plots are rife. Stronger still are the temptations that dwell in the heart. Temptations that even the bravest may succumb to. ...
Hello everyone. Hello Callum and welcome back James.
Thank you. Great to be back.
I already feel anxious about what we're going to talk about. Callum, your introduction has set the tone.
Yes, I hope it wasn't too much of an anguish having the ... Critical Role reference in there.
An excellent episode of Critical Role. In 2 words, let's split it between you. In 2 words, sum up what this episode is going to be about. We're going to start with Callum and it's going to be seamless. Callum and then James. What is the episode about?
Shadow.
I was looking for shadow lore, but that's good. It
I was
felt
looking for
esoteric
shadow
and
lore.
abstract. It's good.
I thought we were going for the shadow.
I was
And then
going
Callum
for
said
shadow lore.
and I was like, I guess I'm not saying shadow. I'm going to just say the then.
So we're going to talk about the shadow and specifically shadow lore, which is the
Yes.
mechanic in AiME. This is something that sets the game apart from kind of vanilla 5e, I think is fair to say. Is it worth starting just with a bit about what the shadow, which is quite an abstract concept, is in Tolkien, and then why the game designers put it kind of at the heart of these rules?
Okay,
I don't count from Lore Master's point of view, the shadow.
I'm going to go. Nominate contestant James.
What is the shadow?
And why is it important to Tolkien?
Why is it important to Tolkien? Just asking the easy questions.
You've got 30 seconds.
And do I? So, to me, there is this central chord to Tolkien's work that is this awareness of bad things happen in the world. It's not, as it's sometimes portrayed as, this purely there are good guys and there are bad guys, and the good guys beat the bad guys, and it's all neat and simple and tidy. That's not actually how things work in Middle-earth. There is a clear sense of what good is and what evil is, but people remain complicated. And there is this sense of the possibility of corruption, of not just a failure of ability, but a failure of will and a failure of conscience that continually is a present throughout all Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is a bit more complicated because of the different editions, and there is a shift that occurs in the edition that changes the backstory for how Bilbo obtains the ring from Gollum, which I think is a very interesting example almost of textual corruption in a weird kind of way. Sorry, I'm getting very English nerd here.
No, I haven't said anything because I'm absolutely loving this.
But that there is this sense of what we thought was this very simple story actually had this deeper hidden aspect to it. Of course, Tolkien only came up with that later, but he very cleverly reworked the original version to be the sanitized version that Bilbo told other people. So, and Bilbo is a hero. Bilbo is, certainly not flawless in The Hobbit, but he is your plucky adventurer type who gets over his fear of, the unpredictable, quality of adventuring life. But no less than Thorin, who succumbs to dragon sickness for the wealth of the Horde in Erebor, Bilbo begins to succumb to the effect of the ring. So the shadow, as Callum's introduction suggests, is not just about orcs and Nazgul and creepy things that go bump in the night. It's also about the shadow on our hearts, or of our hearts. You know, it's this constant challenge to try and be our best selves, and the things that pull us away from that. It's, you know, Boromir is, I think, the example I always think of. I'm sure most people think of, because Boromir is a hero, but it's not. But his desperation to be a hero, to save his city, turns him towards darkness.
He and his story is, I think, the example we should use when we talk about the shadow rules, because they can be a bit tricky to get your head around how the game designers have taken Tolkien's vision of shadow and put it into a system. But I think perhaps more than any other part of the game, this is done so well, I think.
That's an interesting question. I think you're right. And I think Boromir is a great example. And actually, if I really want to hear your thoughts in a second as the lore master about shadow in the game. But talking about Boromir, I, for work, got an opportunity to write about 20 years since The Fellowship of the Ring came out. And I was thinking a lot about watching it as a child and reading the book as a child, and the bits I enjoyed, the adventure. And now that I'm older and looking back on the films and the book, how much more I enjoy Boromir as a character, because I think the idea of his flaw and the shadow in his heart, when you're a child, like he comes across, I think, almost like slightly like a minor villain at the end. As a kid, I was just like, oh, he's not as heroic as Aragorn. Whereas now, he is, certainly in the first book and the first film, the character that I love watching the most. He's the character that inspired Halmir, who's the character I've played mostly throughout this campaign. So I was doing a bit of writing about the anniversary of the film, and it really got me thinking. It ties in with the shadow. Have you ever seen Peter Jackson's World War II in color, They Shall Not Grow Old, which he did, which was released at Christmas a few years ago? He pulled together loads of footage from the First World War, colorized it into a film, which had narration. And it was a real passion project for him. It was really moving. Scenes from the trenches and also the soldiers when they get home. And it was only really then that I really thought about how Tolkien had been one of these soldiers. Like, he was of that generation who had gone to war and had seen some of the things that are depicted in the film, which, like, as kids, we would never have understood. And there's a bit at the end of the film where they're reading diaries of some of the people who've come back from war. And they talk about how they found it really difficult to return to normal life, because for people who were at home, they didn't see the trenches. Their life didn't change that much in the same way as the people who went to France. And there are loads of diaries, and he reads through all these entries of them saying the thing they struggled with most was just trying to be normal, and that no one understood what they'd seen. And I think it's really echoed at the end of Return of the King when they return to the Shire, and the idea that for the hobbits, that they are the soldiers who've gone abroad and then come home, and at home in Hobbiton everything's the same, but Sam and Frodo, Merry and Pippin struggle to communicate what they've experienced. And this is a long way of saying I think that is what the shadow is the dark parts of things that happen in the world. And like you say, not just villains and enemies and orcs and goblins, but that darker part of humanity that once the characters see it, they know it's out there in the world, it's hard to then return to this kind of idyllic Shire life. I guess that's kind of what I think about.
Might just be nonsense, but it just comes to my head that everything casts a shadow. So all objects, all people, all places, there's shadow there, and you can bring a light and try and just get rid of the shadow and drive it back. But at the end of the day, there will still be some shadow, no matter how bright the light is. And that shadow is, every character in all the books. Nobody is completely flawless. Even Aragorn, even Galadriel are tempted by the ring and resist it. So it's this pervasive evil in the world. And it's, I guess, part to like go super, and James knows a lot more about this than me, but my understanding is that, at the beginning, when the Valar first are come into the world, and Morgoth corrupts so much stuff, and there's all these unnamed things, and evil is worked into the north, and there's this pervasiveness about Morgoth, the first Dark Lord's work in the world, that means it touches everything, and the shadow is always there. And Sauron's coming much later on, and we're joining the story much later on, but that is still there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. There are two phrases I think about. Again, from this perspective, not of the shadow as a supervillain, as as a big bad, but what the shadow, I feel like, really means for Tolkien in a more existential way, which is one, the discussion, Frodo's experience is the idea of wounds that will never fully heal. His encounter on Weathertop, being stabbed by the Witch King, and then also being poisoned by Shelob, are things that will stay with him, and which eventually lead him to depart Middle-earth and go to Valinor. So wounds that will never fully heal. The other thing I think about, and in some ways these are, I think, opposite sides of the same coin, when Galadriel talks about the long defeat, and the idea that however hard the free people try, however many victories the free people win, things just are always continually slightly diminished. The elves leave, everything fades. There is a flaw in the world because of Morgoth, which I guess you could see as somewhat analogical to the fall in classic Christian mythology, but that there is this thing that happened at the beginning that means that the world is broken in some way, that cannot be fixed by picking up a magic sword and stabbing a bad guy.
Yeah.
Wow. It's a complex concept, and as a game designer, I think if I imagine coming in and being like, we're going to make Adventures in Middle-earth, we're going to make a role-playing game set in Lord of the Rings, and I think there are other games that I've seen, like the older role-playing games, and I don't think they really address this in the same way that they have managed to do here, to bring that complex concept, boil it down into a series of rules that then influence player behavior. And I guess, as we were talking about in an earlier episode, you kind of want to, how did you put it, Josh? You put it very well. Design the game to reward behavior in players that you want to see. Is that
exactly? And I think in this case, finding a way to represent the shadow in the game so that it is part of our role play, in terms of it's how our characters see the world, it's how we make decisions about the way we act, the way we prioritize our goals, where we go, how we do things. I think as a game designer, what you would be looking to do is be like, okay, I want them to think about the shadow when they make their decisions. So that's part of Tolkien's world. So I want it to be part of their experience as players. How can I make sure when they're making decisions, they're thinking about the shadow? And to do that, you basically want to reward, or I suppose in the flip side, punish, but there's a bit of both, the way that people do that based on the shadow. And there's, I think, quite an elegant structure of rules, which we'll run through, of how when we make decisions and how, particularly as an adventuring party, when we are often more in touch with the shadow than perhaps the common folk of Middle-earth might be, what effect, lingering effect, that has on us, and how far we are maybe willing to go. So I think first, perhaps if we talk about shadow lore as a start, which is one of the new new skills, excuse me, that's introduced into the game and which has become really important, and which is good that we've got James here because it is pretty central to what Torvald is doing.
So I've got the rules here on Shadow Lore. A dark branch of knowledge is an intelligence-based skill, and Shadow Lore checks allow you to share what you've learned about the ways of the enemy and the various creatures that stalk through the shadows of Middle-earth. Where lore, which is another new skill, which I don't think we've really talked about before, deals with the past, Shadow Lore deals with the present and the rising threat of the enemy's many minions. And I guess if you were to encapsulate it into a person, Saruman is your Shadow Lore expert. He is the person in Middle-earth. And I guess we were in the last episode talking about Torvald and him learning the Black Speech and gaining 4 shadow points. You know, how many shadow points did Saruman gain doing all this study into the machinations of the enemy? You know, maybe that's what led to his fall.
Yeah, I think there's very interesting conversations to be had about Saruman as a character in the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work more broadly, all the background that exists around that. So we did have a brief encounter with Saruman at one point in the game, which happened in a very shadowy place. It's kind of interesting that he is, I think in some ways very well deployed by Callum, in the sense that he did come in somewhat as the cavalry, classic mode, bailed us out of a sticky situation. Literally, in Torvald's case, had actually fallen into a pool of probably not very nice, I don't know, goo. And so we were relieved, and we were relieved as players, and obviously the characters were extraordinarily relieved. But there is something unsettling. Obviously, we know that Saruman has an ability that makes him, as we've discussed, I think, was it the previous session of the game, Callum, or the one before that?
Because I think there was a mismatch from people were like, oh, well, Saruman wasn't that nice, but they actually, there's a thing in the rules about Saruman. His voice is so charming that you always come away from thinking he was amazing, the best person I've ever met.
So as the characters would just see that, absolutely. But as players, not because we know who Saruman is, but also just because we know that here's this guy who comes in and seems to just know more about all this dark lore, that there is this risk of becoming consumed by it in some way, of sort of all the good parts of yourself being turned towards their most malicious potentialities.
Shadow Lore is a really useful check to have.
Yes.
And James deploys it very well as Torvald. So, maybe how can we discuss about how it's used and how it works in the game?
So one thing we did not talk about in the previous episode is one of the base scholar abilities, which is the Path of Wisdom. At second level, choose either medicine and 1 skill proficiency or medicine and proficiency with herbalism kit. Your proficiency bonus is doubled for any ability checks that use either of your choices. It is, in other words, a version of expertise from D&D 5e. And then it says, whenever you gain a new skill proficiency, you may move your double proficiency bonus to the new skill, which I did when I got Shadow Lore, because as Callum pointed out, it is so useful to understanding what you're up against in any encounter with the enemy with a capital E. And so what it means for Torvald is that by far his highest skill modifier is Shadow Lore. And it means he can reach, mechanically speaking, those high DCs much more easily. He only has to roll a 14 to hit a 25. He can reach 30 or 31 with a natural 20. And that means...
Yeah, which you've done.
Which I have done at least once,
past,
maybe twice.
Yeah.
Which means that there is, again, thinking about, and obviously this episode is not about Tord, and we talked about Tord plenty on the previous episode, and we're going to go for 3 hours this time, guys. No.
I
But it means that he gets to fulfill that role of figuring out what's going on. What is the enemy's plan? Which is something it's very important in Lord of the Rings. There's a lot that depends on anticipating what Sauron's doing, what Saruman's doing, understanding that what Saruman is doing is not necessarily what Sauron thinks he is or should be doing, and understanding that the shadow is destructive towards life and light, but it is also destructive towards itself because that is its nature, which we took advantage of in Gundabad. Or I don't know if we did it deliberately, but it ended up happening anyway.
We did rather set the shadow against itself. Here's a question for you then. We've got here the lore master, who obviously oversees the delivery of any shadow lore, and in Torvald, the character who is the person who is best at it. What would be an example for a new lore master of when you would ask for a shadow lore roll instead of just an intelligence check or instead of a lore roll? What would be an example of something that you would require this as the skill? It's a question for you both.
I mean, the one that comes to mind only because I was rereading Torvald's journal in preparation for the previous session is
what a scholarly thing to do.
Yes, I came, did my reading, I came prepared. Earlier, you see, I had already set in place plans for this exact moment.
Oh, well played.
Well, you're level 13
I just
already.
happened to have these fireworks.
Whoa.
No. When we first went to the Gladden Fields in the shadow of the Dwemerhorn, we found some orcs and we defeated them, and they had markings on them.
Yes.
And that was an early shadow lore check I remember very distinctly, because that gave us some information, not complete information, but a bit of information about what kinds of groups of orcs we were dealing with. What we specifically learned, I think, is that they weren't local, is my recollection.
Yeah.
And in fact, there might be more than one group. And so while we as players might surmise that, as characters, suddenly we came to a realization that this is more than just a raiding party or something like that, that there was this wider scheme afoot, and that was built all part of the build up to this first big story arc that we had in the game that raised the stakes. I think what you did very well was not like, oh, well, this means that, you have the full picture. It wasn't like that. It was very much like, well, there was hints, I think, towards the complexities behind the initial discovery. I don't know if that summons up anything for you, Callum.
Yeah, the Gladden Fields I love doing that bit because it's in the game very close to the Anduin Vale where you were spending a lot of time. And we know from the lore that that's where the Isildur and many of his company, his sons, a lot of these men of Arnor were killed at the Battle of the Gladden Fields. And that's, known. And so you're left wondering, well, what's around there? If someone was to be really good at shadow lore, they might think that the ring might have ended up there, which it did. And Gollum found it in the river, or Smeagol, I guess, or Deagle found it and then Smeagol took it, I guess. So, there's stuff going on there, and it would make sense that you can build an adventure around that, and Saruman might turn up, and what other artifacts are lurking in the water in the things that are old Numenorian things. That's not really about shadow lore, but I just really enjoyed running that section of the game. So what was the question?
For a new... This is why you're here. Your enthusiasm is important. The question was, speaking to a new lore master, and they're wondering, when am I asking for these checks? What would be an example of something that someone would ask for a shadow lore check rather than a lore check?
What's up with these orcs?
I think it's... I actually think this one's fairly straightforward. The one I struggle with is like, when is it traditions? When is it history? When is it lore? Like that there's overlap there. I think shadow lore is anything that I can relatably think this is to do with the enemy. then it will be shadow lore. And I also am a bit lenient in terms of like, so say someone is investigating a scene, I'll try, and I'm getting better at this, I think, is offer alternatives, or say to players, what skill check do you think is relevant here, and then allow people to try and justify it, because I think that's, characters will approach situations in different ways. There is the classic debates of, say, investigation versus perception checks, which we won't get into, but there is an argument to say, like, well, if this could be shadow lore, then that is relevant, but it could also be an investigation check, or it probably could be a history check, and I'll give you a different answer based on which check you use.
I'm trying to think if there was any time where I was like, can I shadow lore check this? And no, I wouldn't say it like that, obviously. But if it was clear that
insight check.
Yeah, I totally do sometimes say it like that.
We all do that, though.
I'm just trying to think if there's a time when I have wanted to pursue that line of inquiry and you've shut it down. I can't really think of one. There are times, again, perception versus investigation is a classic one, where other things have come up. But I think it's always been fairly clear. I guess maybe, I don't think it came up. I guess maybe with some factions of men who are not good, there might, but maybe if they're not directly servants of evil, like obviously if it's like the Corsairs of Umbar, then yes, probably some amount of shadow lore might be relevant. If it's like some of those rubbish Lake Town criminals we occasionally run into, and honestly, they're more scared of us than we are of them, then I don't know if shadow lore is particularly relevant in that situation.
Yeah, that's a good point to say. Actually, where does something stop or start being shadowy? Because as we've already said, the shadow can affect everybody, and are you just a slightly dishonest merchant, or are you a Nazgul? So there's a line somewhere between those two.
Cheese merchant.
No. Blessed are the cheese makers.
We're just going to leave this hanging. We're not going to give any context to the mysterious cheese merchant.
Way better if we give no context.
Let's move on. So I feel like we've gone a depth into shadow lore there. Should we move on to talking about the shadow points, or is there anything else we want to say about shadow lore?
Before we wrap up, just something, because Stuart touched on this when he was talking about Runin, was one of Runin's abilities as a wanderer is he gets a bonus to fighting against shadowy enemies. But there's sometimes a question of when he's fighting something in the wilderness, if it is something that's just scary, or whether it's something that's actually malign in some way. So, for instance, we fought wolves before, which are wild animals. And I think he'd asked, are these shadowy creatures? And I got the sense a few times he'd ask questions and it gave you pause for thought of, actually, are these wolves shadowy, or they're just an environmental danger? But then what if they were wargs? Or what if that's a werewolf? Or what if they're giant bats? That's another time that shadow lore, I wonder if that kind of question rolls in there.
And I also wonder if it comes down to motivations as well. So you could have a wolf that is just out hunting and looking for food, but later on, sometime later, that wolf could come under the effect of a warg, was leading the tribe. And then, what is its intentions, its motivations? And that's generally what I'm thinking about when it comes down to that. I guess there's some creatures that are so bent and twisted by the shadow, like orcs, for example. I don't think they would ever not be shadowy, but if there's a creature, terrible. I'm trying to think what James is smiling about.
So many things. I was thinking one, we can't get into whether orcs are inherently evil. You just can't go there.
Yes, that's a tricky topic.
That's you weren't going there. That was me. I summoned that particular spectre. The other thing I was thinking when you just said talking about the wolf's motivation, I was just thinking about the bit in Galaxy Quest where Tim Allen is fighting the rock monster, and the advice that Alan Rickman's character is try and understand what it wants, what's its motivation, as a joke on like this is how an actor would approach this problem of trying to understand the motivation. Sorry, I've
excellent
completely
film. I want to go watch that.
Best Star Trek film. I think not entirely irrelevant to the question of shadow and the way Tolkien uses the word black, which I think this is not what this meeting is. This is not what this.
Very official.
Very official. This is not what this episode is about. I think, however, we should note that that's a thing there and it's worth talking about, even if we're not getting into it now, because we're talking about the game and how the game works and how the game uses Tolkien's ideas. We're not talking about the cultural placement of those ideas.
You know, it is clearly an issue, and it's something that we need to talk about and be conscious about. And I guess it's one of those things as well that we can't just place in a little box and say, like, this is the episode about that. So I think that's something that we'll touch on as we go through talking about Tolkien's world, because it's a pervasive issue and it's obviously very important.
Indeed.
Let's talk about shadow points.
Yes.
Let's talk about shadow points.
Yes. Or what's it called? It's called the shadow in the rules. So maybe I can just lay out the rules quickly and then we can discuss them.
What are the mechanics? How does this work from the rule book?
Okay. So there is a system in the game where characters can accrue shadow points. Oh, points. Points means prizes. No. In this situation, points are bad.
Amazing.
Right? So there are things called sources of corruption, which lead to adventurers accumulating shadow points. And it's an abstract way of representing the growing burden of grief, doubt, weariness, self-interest that comes into their hearts. And there's 4 ways in which heroes risk gaining shadow points. One is experiencing distressing events, which is known as anguish, hence the pun at the beginning of the podcast, which is bad. The second is crossing or dwelling in an area tainted by manifestations of the shadow, that's blighted places. Third is committing despicable or dishonorable deeds, regardless of the end they sought to achieve. So, in Curse of Strahd yesterday, I think my character did something that was a bit bad, but for a good reason, and that's fine. But in Adventures of Middle-earth, you could do that, but you probably will get shadow points for doing bad things. That's called misdeeds. And the last one is taking possession of cursed or tainted items or treasure. Tainted treasure. So anguish, blighted places, misdeeds, tainted treasure.
Some examples to go along with these 4 things.
Yes.
So anguish is things we see. We often find this with journey events. There'll be a sort of traumatic or evil sight that we'll see, and it will result in us needing to make a corruption saving throw, which is another new mechanic that's been finessed on. It's effectively a wisdom saving throw, but you can be proficient in corruption saving throws. So it actually exists as a separate stat. And that's kind of about partly how hardy you are and how resilient you are about seeing potentially shadowy events. Blighted lands is quite clear, really, isn't it? There are on the map, and this is something that really fits in with Wanderers, like with Runin. On the map, there are areas that are simply blighted because of what goes on there and the lore. Misdeeds is the one I wanted to touch on because it's probably the most role-play linked one. It's the one that we as players are most likely to trigger. And I did trigger it early on as I was Halmir, who's the character I'm playing now. Halmir started the game with a lot of shadow points because he was kidnapped by orcs and spent a long period of time at the Dwimmerhorn, which is this fortress we've talked about. And actually part of the Dwimmerhorn quest was he got rescued. He was very tainted by the shadow and he had a lot of shadow points as I started playing him. One of the early quests he went on was with a dwarf. We crossed Mirkwood. Halmir was still kind of struggling with everything that had happened. He didn't have any money. He was in a foreign place. He didn't really know what was going on. And he'd had a bit of a tiff with this dwarf. And just as we were finishing our business with him in a pub in Laketown, I believe, Halmir actually pulled a knife on the dwarf and demanded more money, which is not a very Tolkien thing to do. It's not a very heroic thing to do. I kind of was in 2 minds about it, but I felt that Halmir had a lot of shadow points and was in a dark place and it made sense. But that, you said, Callum, was a misdeed and he got shadow points for doing that.
I remember the time you were a bit upset, I think, because you did it in a very in character moment, and then I was like, it can. You said the word punishment earlier on, and this is a tricky
Yes.
thing with misdeeds. Is it sometimes feels to me like you role play your character, you do what you want, and then I'm like bad. It does feel like you've done a misdeed, you've been naughty. Here's some shadow points. And I think maybe a way, not around that, but to just make it clear to a player that, and I hope I've managed to do this more, is say, are you sure you want to do that? That will be counting as a misdeed or something along those lines. So signposting to people that, and most of the time people were still like, yeah, I think this is what they would do for X, Y, or Z. Well, we've started talking about misdeeds. Maybe I'll just spell out what the misdeeds are. So if you have an accidental misdeed, so, like you swing your arm, oops, sorry, I cut, Delilah's throat.
That's a specific example.
I don't know what that example was. I don't know what that was. Anyway, if it's an accident, no shadow gain. If you do a violent threat, which is really interesting because there's a line there, you gain 1 shadow point. If you lie purposely, subtly manipulate the will of others,
Very
2
Kantian.
points.
Sorry.
It is actually.
Cowardice, theft, and blunder, 3 points.
I'm sorry, blunder.
Blunder with a P.
Blunder.
Blunder,
I meant
sorry.
blunder. I was like, how is that?
That was a blunder.
shadowy?
That was a blunder.
Which actually,
Blackout.
we'll maybe finish reading through them and we'll come back to plunder because
Yes.
there's
I'm reading this. I'm like, oh,
there's a thing we need to talk about.
Unprovoked aggression, abusing own authority to influence or dominate, 4 points, and drum roll, please. Worst of all, expulsion from high. No, that's a different thing. Torment and torture, murder. 5 points. Which is funny is that you just go up a little bit. Murder's quite bad, isn't it? So you commit misdeed, you get shadow gain.
Plunder is an interesting one.
Thoughts?
The cowardice, theft, and plunder. Because we actually had a conversation in character about, or one of those conversations that's sort of in character, but also sort of trying to figure out what the rules are. And maybe it's one of those cases, Callum, where maybe it is appropriate to, and we're very much figuring out the game at this point and how to play games like this more generally. And actually, you did come in and say, I don't think this would be a misdeed. So you did actually come in and give the Lawmaster ruling. But we had this sort of half in character, half as players conversation when we defeated the troll.
Yes.
And found our way into the secret tomb beneath the city of the Earthed. Spoilers for that, I guess, because I think that is a part of the materials for Adventures in Middle-earth. And then Callum said that you do not. You think I think under the circumstances it wasn't plunder because we were actually, now that we had opened the tomb, we had to preserve. We knew the orcs were coming back. We had to preserve the items. And I think the logic was that wasn't really plunder because that you could maybe call it an accidental misdeed in opening the tomb, but once it was opened, we had to make sure these things did not fall into the hands of the orcs. Was, I think, eventually the reasoning we landed on. But it is an interesting intersection between these specific rules from Adventures in Middle-earth that tie in with the Shadow and what we expect from games like this.
Yeah.
But also worth noting, of course, that Gandalf and Bilbo and Thorin retrieve swords from the troll horde in The Hobbit. And that's cool. Everyone's favorite Fellowship of the Ring character, Tom Bombadil, retrieves 4 daggers of Numenorian make to give to the hobbits from the barrows, from the grave goods. So that it seems to be okay to take stuff from graves or troll hordes. So I guess the interesting question is, and it's not really come up, when does it become plunder?
One for the lore master to decide, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you just have to just make a decision. I don't know. I'm not sure I have a system. It's just, does it feel right?
Yeah.
What's the vibes?
What's the
What's
vibe?
the vibes? What's the vibes?
What's the vibes? So that's a misdeed. Should we talk about anguish? So it's different. I'm not going to read through the whole table of anguish because that would take ages. But basically, there's sources of anguish. So say something natural happens as an unexpected tragedy, you might get a shadow point, but only if you fail a wisdom saving throw with a 1 or a 2, the corruption saving throw. So it's quite hard to get anguish shadow points from that. If you witness a gruesome killing, some terrible experience, if you fail the shadow point, you get the corruption saving throw, you get a shadow point. If there's a harrowing experience or torment or sorcery, you get 2 saving shadow points. God, I'm not doing this well. You get 2 shadow points if you fail the corruption saving throw. And finally, if you experience directly the power of the enemy, you gain 1 shadow point regardless of the outcome of your saving throw, and then you might get another 2 if you fail the check, which is
hefty.
Pretty free. I don't think anybody's actually failed that check. That has come up. I know Malbeth had to make that check, and I think he failed actually. So maybe he'd get free shadow points in that situation. So anguish comes up a lot actually. I think that's probably the thing that I use most out of these, because you're good. You don't normally use misdeeds. And I've just read through the Blighted Lands thing again and realized that I haven't been doing that. So I kind of take a slightly more arbitrary approach to Blighted Lands, and just I prefer doing the corruption saving throws in a narrative sense. So it suggests rules for Blighted Lands where, depending what the area is, number of how often you have to make corruption saving throws. But I prefer to do it like there's this terrible gruesome thing, and then I get to describe a terrible gruesome thing, which is always fun, and then you have to make a corruption saving throw. And basically when I start making those descriptions and put on that voice, I think everyone's eyes, I can see that they're like, oh, we're gonna have to make a corruption saving throw. Or maybe is that true?
We can usually see it coming.
Yeah,
that's nice. I like that.
It works. No, it's a good build up to it. It feels like it doesn't feel, again, it doesn't feel punishing, to go back to what we were talking earlier. It feels like, right, yes, we have chosen to come here, and this is the consequence.
Because there is a suggested thing. So on the map for the Lore Master, there's difficulties of terrain, but there's also stuff about whether it's free lands down to wild or shadow or dark lands. And when you get to dark lands, you make a corruption saving throw every hex you cross, which is 10 miles.
That's insane.
Every hex
we would not
cross.
have made it.
It's coming up a lot.
Of AiME.
Oh yeah,
no, sorry, AiME's Shadowland. We would not have made it.
It's only every 2.
We would probably not have made it through Mount Gundabad.
You would have had to make 2 additional corruption saving throws there. I think you only made 1. So yeah, the Blighted Lands, I guess when you're doing the journeys, I think it's just, for me, it's always been something just a bit much to think about, but
I guess it's
maybe
it might be an interesting thing to experiment with in future.
Yeah. It's good to have a guide on the frequency at which you should be asking people to make checks and have something to justify it as well. But I prefer working it in a narrative sense to just saying you've moved 2 hexes, make a check.
Yeah, I think it could work, but I also get what you mean.
And finally, we've got Tainted Treasure, which I don't think it is quite straightforward. Depending on where you get the treasure for, it might be cursed and you might have to make a corruption saving throw. And there's a table in the book that gives you DCs and how many shadow points you get. So that's, I guess, how you gain shadow points. How about removing shadow points? So you've got your Torvald, James, you mentioned earlier on that Torvald had gotten a load of shadow points and you immediately removed them. How did you go about doing that?
Well, we were in the middle of the fellowship phase.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
There we go. Which, and in the course of the fellowship phase, you, as discussed, I think on a previous episode, you can take different undertakings. And one of these is, I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, actually.
It's called Heal Corruption.
And you can make a roll to see whether or not you are successful in healing corruption. And if it is a really good roll, as mine was, as I recall, you can heal more corruption.
So narratively, what's happening is you're spending the fellowship phase, which could be weeks, maybe months, And we've role
Yes.
played out what people would be doing to actually try and cleanse themselves of this shadow that's on them.
A player hero wishing to remove their corruption must make a DC 13 Wisdom Insight ability check. If successful, they remove 2 shadow points. If their ability check results in a total of 25 or more, they remove 4 shadow points, which is what I did.
You got your
If
insights proficiency from being a barding.
Yes, exactly. If it suits a player hero's personality, the Loremaster may allow the substitution of another ability like a charisma check with a musical instrument or strength test with blacksmithing tools. This idea that depending on your character, they might be doing different things. And then we talked about this in game in relation to Runin and Runin's blacksmithing, I believe.
Yeah, he's done some of that recently.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because I never like it when it's a specific part of the game is locked behind having one specific proficiency or being strong in wisdom, because then it's like, well, every character I take, then I'll just put insight on as a skill and I'll make sure wisdom's always high. Having good wisdom in AiME is a very good idea, by the way, because we'll come on to the rules of shadow points and what happens when they get too high. But yeah, I think it's being flexible and allowing people to, who am I to say how you go about removing shadow and how you relax?
There is other sort of focused ways of doing it, narratively speaking. The Bjornings can take an undertaking at the Carrick, which is very important in Tolkien's lore. In the middle of the River Anduin, Hobbit passes by there as a story. Bjornings who go to the Carrick can double the speed at which they remove shadow, because it is a spiritual place of sorts for them. And what I liked about that was that when I was Theodric and I had shadow points, there was a sort of a pilgrimage you had to make, and we played it. It wasn't easy. It wasn't just a hand wave like, oh, I go to the Carrick. Theodric had to go there, and I think it was reasonably challenging to get there. And that spending time there meant he got to make twice as many rolls to get rid of shadow points. And that felt cool, because it felt for Theodric like, well, it's great when I'm here, I can remove shadow there. And I'd also thought to myself, if we end up further away from home and I get a lot of shadow, I'm going to, and this goes back to the game design, reward the behavior you want. I'm going to want to go back to the Carrick because I get a bonus. So it helped tie together the Bjornings as a race. And I like that there are different kind of culture benefits.
Yes, there's a couple other ones, but I won't tell you what they are because some of them are slightly spoilery. The only one I would mention is that it's not quite the same, but if you're in Rivendell, then your shadow points default to 0. It counts as if you don't remove them, but they count as if they're 0. And I believe that when you're in Rivendell and you take the Heal Corruption undertaking, you get a similar bonus to the Carrick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the idea. I think that the shadow doesn't really weigh on people at Rivendell, but it doesn't go away, but it doesn't really affect them.
Yeah.
While
it's
they're
brilliant.
While
And
they're
actually
there.
for role playing, it's really great to come in and then, I don't know if that influenced when you were in Rivendell recently playing characters. Were you thinking about that? That made that clear to everybody that you wouldn't have shadow
I
points?
think I was, actually, because again, I took the same undertaking initially, which I wasn't actually sure I was going to do, because I was like, at a certain point, if you have enough shadow, maybe it becomes harder to quit, as it were. But then I was like, but if you're in Rivendell, you would probably know that you would have that clarity by being there and not being affected by the shadow, to know that actually, no, what I really need is to take care of oneself. So actually, I was initially thinking I would roll a wisdom check of some kind to see whether or not I'd actually take that undertaking or whether I'd ignore the problem. But then once I was in Rivendell and you're like, well, you're acting as if you have no shadow points. And I was like, oh, I was going to treat the number of shadow points I had as the DC or for the wisdom check or something. I was like, well, the DC is effectively 0 then.
I love how you thought that out with so much detail.
Yes, there was a quite a convoluted thought process there.
It's quite useful as a system because I think it does help with role playing. As you get more shadow points, people lean into it. So you can remove shadow points. We should talk about the miserable condition and just spell out how these rules works. And maybe I'll do that.
I was going to say.
Probably
I
got
was
the
just going to
best.
say.
Oh yeah.
That there is another way of losing shadow points, which
well,
is
that's yes. It's a sort of nuclear option of losing shadow points. So what happens when you get more and more shadow points? You keep getting more shadow points. You keep plundering Bjorn's hall. You keep stealing his honey. Stop it. So if you ever get to a point where your shadow point total exceeds your, I don't know why I did that. Your shadow point total exceeds your wisdom score. So, for example, Torvald had a wisdom of, 16? So if you had 17 shadow points, I don't think it's equal. I think it has to exceed. They become miserable. And what does miserable mean? So if you're miserable, you have disadvantage on attack rolls, and you automatically fail all charisma ability checks, which was very important recently because was it Halmir became miserable at one point and then
I became
you were going to make a
miserable
charisma check and you realized that actually you were just going to fail.
Yep.
Which was key actually.
Yes, we've had 2 characters become miserable, I believe.
Halmir's miserable was quite recently. Misery.
Yeah, you actually not entirely dissimilar circumstances in some ways. In the sense of it happened while in the middle of
really bad situations,
the middle of a fight or prolonged conflict encounter, and in the middle of a place of shadow.
So miserable is bad. You don't want to be miserable, just like in real life. And whilst you're miserable, you can temporarily counteract those problems by spending your inspiration to either remove disadvantage on the attack roll, or if you spend inspiration, it allows you are able to take a charisma check at disadvantage, which I don't think I knew about or remembered. So what you're miserable. Okay, how do you get out of being miserable? How do you get rid of these shadow points? Well, you now keep track of when you roll your dice, and if you ever roll equal or less than the difference between your shadow point total and their wisdom whilst making an ability check, attack roll, or saving throw, they experience a bout of badness. So just to spell that out, so say you're Torvald and your wisdom is 16 and you've got 17 shadow points. If you ever roll a 1, which is the difference, which is why it has to be higher, if you ever roll a 1, you're going to have a bout of madness. Say your shadow point total was 20 and your wisdom is 16. If you ever rolled a 4 or less on an ability check or an attack or anything else, you would experience a bout of madness. And actually, this happens quite quickly because you're rolling with disadvantage a lot. So I think in both cases, the bout of madness has come on pretty quick. You're kind of in that stage. You're unlikely to get to a fellowship phase and be able to take heal corruption. So once you've got miserable, you kind of want to just have the madness over and done with as soon as possible, in my opinion. I don't know how you feel about this as players, but
in a way, yes. And the mechanic is designed to spiral, that it just increases the chances that you're going to have a bout of madness. And you're right that because of the way the madness works, once it's done, and it's cleared. What we found out, though, with Halmir when we were in Gundabad is if you have a bout of madness in a very dangerous situation, you lose control of the character. And the more dangerous the situation is, you may not get them back.
Yes. A bout of madness is triggered by rolling that thing. And when it happens, the player relinquishes control of their character to the lore master for a short period of time. Or
the lore master can choose to
hold on,
delay
the
bout of madness until a more devastating moment.
Yeah. The lore master plays out the crisis, making the character do something they will later regret. Here are some examples of the consequences of the bout of madness. Those fireworks you brought earlier on, you set them off inside. No, that's not the example.
So is this an actual example?
It's like The Sims. You ever play that and you set the fireworks off inside and everyone's running around. So, for example, desperation, the hero cannot find a trace of hope in the spirit and thus cannot use inspiration until their heart is again lifted. Oh. Well, we could use the example of Halmir. So Halmir was in a situation where they were in Gundabad. They'd completed their mission. They'd rescued someone that they were there and they were trying to make their way out. But Halmir, one too many bad things happened and he went mad. And what happened? Maybe you can describe it.
Well, this is something we'd actually talked about. And I think you slightly tailored the Bout of Madness to the character because we discussed this, which was that Halmir, a soldier, he'd largely led this expedition to Gundabad, all of them had seen some very dark things. He'd racked up a lot of shadow points. He became miserable, and then he failed his role. He had a bout of madness. I had said to you, kind of behind the scenes for quite a while, if things are getting perilous in Gundabad, because Halmir is the one who's brought us here, he will sacrifice himself to let the others escape. I felt that would be, if it got so desperate, that would be in character. He was a soldier, he was a leader, he was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice if he felt that was what was needed. And the way that you picked up the Bout of Madness was Halmir thought that he needed to sacrifice himself for the others to get away. The circumstance, actually, he didn't, but he had slightly lost grip of reality and had gone into that mode that he was already ready for. And so you said he's going to storm off down that other tunnel to, create a scene and hold off the orcs while the group escape. The losing kind of the grip thing was that the group were actually not in a position to escape, and the enemies weren't really coming for them at that point. And Halmir was effectively just drawing attention and risking his life. So he ran off down the tunnel towards danger and left the party to handle.
That was a tense moment. That was very tense.
Very tense moment. And there were efforts made by other characters to try and snap him out of it and to restrain him, but he's a strong warrior. He shook him off. It was only the last ditch attempt was Runin said he was just going to fire an arrow at Halmir's knee to try and knock him over or knock him down. Little did Stuart and Runin know that Halmir was so low on hit points that the arrow knocked him to 0 hit points.
Yeah, we talked about that with Stuart on an earlier episode, and
yes, I remember listening to it.
It was a great moment, and that's, I think, what's good about the Bout of Madness and the miserable condition is that it builds these really impactful story moments and creates this challenge which is within the party. And it really, I think, when we talk about Boromir as an example, he goes miserable, he threatens Frodo, his Bout of Madness is trying to take the ring. But what happens once you've had the Bout of Madness is that you lose all of your shadow points and you then gain something called a permanent shadow point. And each point of permanent shadow point you get leads you down a path of degeneration. And the degeneration is basically traits that are added to your character, and they're based on your shadow weakness, which I think we touched on when we were talking about Phaedric. We haven't really talked about it since, but basically all the classes have a different shadow weakness associated with them.
In Halmir's case, as a man of Minas Tirith, he's actually narratively from Dol Amroth, but the cultures of men of Minas Tirith. Shadow weakness is power, I believe, and the first degeneration he gets, which he now has, is he is a resentful person. And that doesn't mean that he's resentful in everything he does, but I'm trying to role play more now in situations where he's maybe not as on board with the plan, that he's slightly more resentful towards other people and perhaps what happened as a result of it.
How do you get the shadow? Is the shadow weakness something you choose, or is it based on the culture or on the class?
Based on your culture.
No, it's based on class.
Is it based on the class?
Based on class.
I thought it was
he's a warrior.
So just to check that. So okay.
So yeah, it's from being a warrior.
Yeah, and you can get up to 4 permanent shadow points, and if you get more than that, for example, power, lure of power. If you got 4 permanent shadow points, you'd be tyrannical.
I feel like
Not
for
a great
most
word.
of them, by the time you get 4, you are essentially a villain.
Yeah.
But,
They suggest if you succumb to the shadows, so if you get 4 shadow points, you're on the edge of succumbing, and if you get another one, then you're hopelessly lost and taken out of play. And the options are either you return to Valinor if you're an elf, or madness. So you may, may go off and you basically become an NPC and something bad happens. It's not good.
I mean, I would say both Denethor and Saruman are also relevant here.
Yes, that's a great example.
And that, I don't think, certainly in the books, Denethor is ever quite as clear cut as a full outright villain. He remains well intentioned. He just can't trust anyone anymore. And to the extent that you could see him falling into the category of, if you were to model it in a system, law of secrets. Which
yes, I was just reading that and thinking the exact same thing. He becomes haughty, scornful, scheming, and then treacherous.
And without meaning to, he ends up betraying essentially the free people.
Yeah.
And Saruman is similar. He probably falls into the same category, but it manifests in a different way. And Saruman maybe, but Denethor maybe never fully reaches full treachery. He doesn't think he's betraying Faramir by setting him on fire. He's too disconnected from reality.
Yeah.
Whereas Saruman is actively betraying everyone up to and including Sauron.
Anybody you possibly can.
Yeah, that's high level play, shadow point stuff. I think where Boromir is a perfect example, because trying to take the ring, and I think why it's so satisfying as the reader or the viewer, the audience for Boromir's story is, from a long way off, you kind of know what the risk is, and the risk is that Boromir will try and take the ring, and you know that as the audience, as the reader, because it is a rational thing for him to do in a way. It's his motivation to protect his people, and his belief that the ring is the key to that makes perfect sense. And that's why I liked what we did with AiME, which was I told you what my plan was if things went wrong, and that was the thing that you used. So to me, it didn't feel like I'd lost player agency. I didn't feel like, oh wait, the lore master's just taken Helmer off to do something that he would never do. There was inevitability from a long way off that this was going to happen, and it was something bad happened and it triggered it, and it makes perfect sense for the character. And why I think it matters so much for Boromir is when he comes out of his bout of madness, if we were in the game, would be the mechanics, he only comes out of it really as he dies. It is really his tragic death. He steps in to save the hobbits and dies, and then he has this moment with Aragorn, and that's it. And that's really all he gets coming out of his bout of madness. I think that's why it's got such a emotive moment.
Absolutely. But there is that the line that Aragorn has in response to Boromir's actions after he threatens Frodo, where he says that few have ever won such a victory.
Yeah.
Speaking to the idea that Boromir was able to, by pushing past that temptation, by realizing the mistake that he had made, and by redeeming himself through trying to defend Merry and Pippin, he doesn't undo what happened, but he does in some way again receive some kind of measure of redemption.
Yeah.
I nearly said salvation. That might be too far.
No, he's spot on. I think spot
on. That's the shadow rules. There's one like small like niche thing to mention, I guess, is that the high elves of Rivendell. So in the Rivendell region guide, high elves of Rivendell have a rule which, if we ever go talk about them at some point, we'll go into more detail. But the set by woe, high elves can never truly forget the taint of the shadow once it's left a mark on their spirit. Whenever you take the undertaking heal corruption, you immediately lose 1 point of temporary shadow and gain 1 point of permanent shadow, and then make the ability check. So essentially, if you build up lots of shadow points, you can try and get rid of them, but you're basically trading it in for permanent shadow points.
You're just converting them into a
which to me,
permanent
it makes me
degeneration.
think I probably would never take heal corruption. I just wait till I go mad, but that's a risk. You don't know what that situation is going to be. So I think what that is that the high elf culture, they are more powerful. They get better benefits, which is unusual for this sort of game, but it's tempered by the fact that those player characters won't be around for very long if you're playing in a setting where there's a lot of shadow points coming in. They're time limited, which is pretty cool.
It's an interesting way of balancing. That's very distinct.
Yeah, it didn't come up when I played a high elf, which is the only person who's played one, because it was say a one shot, but it was, I think, 5 episodes in the end.
It's a kind of limited campaign.
Yeah,
We didn't really have enough for that to have come apart. Okay, how about the system in comparison to other RPG systems of a similar style? Because although shadow as a concept is very Tolkien, this mechanic appears, I think, in a comparable way in a number of other games that I can think of. I think this is a very good example. I don't know if it is reminded either of you of a particular game.
Well, it's there are madness rules in the basic rule set for 5th edition D&D. What strikes me about those rules, and obviously certain campaigns such as Curse of Strahd, you were telling us earlier, have more specific criteria or effects. The basic rules are exactly as they sound. They're fairly broad and generic. There's short-term effects, there's long-term effects, and then there's indefinite effects. And in sort of classic basic D&D style, it's like roll a D100 and see what happens. Obviously, a dungeon master could be at liberty to say you get a specific effect because a specific thing happened, or your character seems to be prone to maybe this kind of thing. But ultimately, these are your standard D&D tables.
Is there rules for what triggers you to have that madness? Or is it just the rule, the
certain spells, such as contact, other plane, and symbol, can cause insanity?
In Curse of Strahd, which is obviously a very famous pre-written module, which I'm currently running for our group, there are numerous points in the module where things that happen can trigger madness, specific things related to the story or to items or to events and things. So I think in the core rules, they're quite general, and I think it's really up to the DM or the writers of Strahd, for instance, to then plonk those in somewhere where it makes sense. But they're not really
some way to resist
baked
it.
in as much. They're not as fleshed out as the shadow rules. There's not really a kind of in and out sort of situation.
Resisting a madness effect usually requires a wisdom or charisma saving throw. It's as specific as it gets.
It's just one check, and it's either pass and you're fine, or fail and terrible thing happens. Whereas the AiME system is cumulative. There's this slow bit, and as Josh said, which I thought was actually really insightful, was that you see this coming. It's not something that is like, it's a sucker save sort of thing where suddenly I'm mad. Whereas a minute ago I was completely sane.
Precisely. No, that's exactly what I was working towards, and I agree. And yes, it just feels like it's so much more built into the characters in Adventures to Middle Earth than it is in. It just seems like this extra thing that is that happens to the characters in the base 5e rule system, whereas in Adventures it feels like it's more in line with who the characters are.
And whilst the way that you become miserable with the getting more shadow points in your wisdom score, I think that took me a while to get my head around, and hopefully we've explained that in a way that makes sense to people. But it works, I would say. I think tying it to the wisdom score gives benefits, but it's not like even if you've got wisdom of 8, which is probably the lowest that you could have, it's still, you've got a decent amount of resistance to it.
Over a prolonged period of time in our campaign, it didn't just come as a sort of a flash. It felt like it was earned. It felt like it was built up over a long period of time. And that, when this happens, it's because not just because I've just seen a bad thing down the corridor, but because of months of long adventuring, something bad has happened.
You do need to get Bert on to talk about Isambard at some point.
I know, yeah. Bert played a Isambard hobbit poor Isambard didn't last very long as a character because he got so many shadow points.
He got so many shadow points.
Bert took
cursed jewelry, misdeeds.
The treasure hunter sort of concept very seriously.
Yeah, he's had 3 player characters, and each of them have been so different and very interesting. I think, there's a lot to talk. We need to have Bert on and speak about his 3 characters and contrast them with each other almost, because and just talk about like what that journey was. I think for him as a player and me as a lore master as well, in terms of that collaborative story. Character creation. Yes. So what other systems do we want to talk about? So we talked about the 5th edition base madness and
yes. Again, it's actually a shame that Bert isn't here to talk about Call of Cthulhu, which he has far more experience with than any of us do, but obviously well known for having a madness mechanic where that is one way your characters can
lose.
I wasn't sure the right word was there. Yes, but as we none of us have any experience of the game, I don't think we can add a lot to that.
It's very well thought of. I think the one, I know I joke about being a massive fanboy of Alien, which I am. The stress mechanic in Free League's Alien game, I think, is comparable and is very good. In short, the way it works, and the idea is to build on this concept of horror, that in a horrific action situation, there's an element of adrenaline and tension that can actually make you better before you lose your mind. The way it works in the game is that you roll a certain number of dice. As you become more stressed, you add extra dice into your pool. And things that stress you out are seeing terrifying things like seeing an alien, one of your companions, being brutally attacked, seeing some kind of unknown space horror. You add more and more dice into your pool, which you're rolling. And the dice that you add in, as long as you're rolling successes, just give you extra dice. They basically make you temporarily better. You're just looking for a 6 on any dice that you roll. Your pool gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You're more likely to roll a 6. But if you ever roll a 1 on they're D6s they roll. If you ever roll a 1 on your stress dice, which are a different color, you panic and things start to go haywire. And panicking, there's a table for panic, much like there are tables for madness. Can be you drop a weapon. It can be that you run and hide. It can be that you scream and effectively cause other people around you to panic. It can be that you just open fire on the nearest person or enemy. And I think it works really well because there's this sweet spot of having some stress dice makes you better at what you're doing, but that inevitability that you are eventually going to panic. I think it's comparable because much like in AiME, there are things you can do to deliberately reduce it. You can recover by resting in certain places and by doing various things. So it has a kind of an up and down track. Like AiME, it feels more nuanced than vanilla 5e. But I think it's worth mentioning because it's a similar structure, which I think speaks to the kind of the core of the game.
It's a very different game design overall, but I think that the alien stress mechanic is so well ingrained into the game.
Yeah.
I'd say it's not like better. It's just a very different game. It's a less complex rule system than AIM is. And they're trying to achieve different things, and they both do it really well.
My favorite thing in the alien system is when you've built up enough stress that you start to get higher on the stress table in terms of the panic table rather. And then there have been certain situations where we want someone to actually roll high on the panic table so they get berserk and shoot the alien.
Yes. And then you just freeze and you're like, no, and then you just die.
Yeah, great game.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great system. What is there any other comparisons you want to draw?
Well, and only because I think, Callum, you mentioned it briefly when talking to Stuart, one of your episodes with Stuart, which was sort of morality systems in video games.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting point of reference. What I always think of is, of course, Mass Effect.
That's it. I was trying to think what the game was.
Yes.
Did you listen to you thinking he's thinking Mass Effect?
Yes, that's exactly what happened.
Oh, okay, because I'm in the game.
I just had to close this loop, Callum. I just had to close this loop.
There's a game in my head, something space. I think I said Fallout or something, which isn't space at all. But
Fallout also has or some Fallouts have a morality mechanic.
It's Mass Effect.
But Mass Effect, you specifically said Paragon, so yeah, that is generally speaking in this context probably you were thinking Mass Effect, which itself I think is loosely based on the sort of light side, dark side meter in BioWare's earlier Star Wars game, Knights of the Old Republic. The difference being that in Knights of the Old Republic, and this is true of I think the Fallout games that tend to have a similar system, you only have one total of points. You're either high. I'm making gestures with my hands in an audio medium. You're either good or you're bad. If you do more good things, you go more towards the good end. If you do more bad things, you go more towards the bad end. You're light side and dark side, right? The difference in Mass Effect is that they're separate meters. You can simultaneously earn more Paragon and more Renegade points and increase different sets of points. What is interesting to me about Adventure Middle Earth in this context is there aren't light points, right? There isn't this sort of balance or this sense of we can sort of quantify exactly how good you are. It doesn't go in that. It doesn't take in that direction. I think that's right for Tolkien. I think it would feel very forced, no pun intended, to bring a Star Wars-like sense of morality. I'm just going for it into Middle Earth because it actually is quite different. Because Star Wars is so, which is where I think a lot of these sort of binary morality systems come from, is basically from Star Wars and video games. It's very sort of Manichaean, Zoroastrian. It has this sort of archaic feeling, like there is a light and there is a shadow, and you could see resemblances to that in Middle Earth, but there isn't the same, I think, experience of that in the world. Middle Earth is not a place where, at least not since the War of Wrath in the First Age, where titans of good and bad fight each other. Middle Earth, by the point we reach in the Third Age, again, this diminished world at the end of the long defeat, is a world in which the Valar are long gone, the elves are leaving. By and large, it's mostly just ordinary people, not Jedi, but it wouldn't seem right to have someone who can be measured as the ultimate hero in this idealized way, to me, in Middle-earth. Some people accuse Aragorn of being that, but I don't think that is how Aragorn comes across to me. He's much more grounded in ideals of kingship rather than this sense of moral purity.
Yeah.
That distinction makes sense.
Yeah, and even like in the lower, in the Fourth Age, Aragorn goes off and conquers a load of people, and there's a sort of kingdom building thing, which if you look at it from a purely morale viewpoint, is that's probably questionable.
Well, Tolkien's politics is a whole other episode.
Well, that's true.
He had very weird politics, to be clear. I'm not simply saying he is as straightforward as he was just very conservative. He was weirder than that.
Well, maybe we need to have you back, James, to have the poll, because I have to admit that I don't know what his politics were, and both
love to talk more about it sometime.
Well, there we go. There we go. That's another episode planned. Put it in the list.
I feel there should be a sound effect now, but
I can add one in. What will the sound effect be?
What's the list sound effect?
It'll be a scribbling sound effect.
Yes.
Oh, scribbling. I don't really like the sound of chalk on blackboard. Should we put that on the podcast and see how few people listen to that? You're welcome. Will this remain in?
What about a stamping noise? Stamping. Everyone loves a stamping noise. It's very satisfying.
Now I feel like we're at the stage of the podcast where we're rambling, and we probably should just finish. So, Josh,
we have discussed The Shadow for good and for ill in Tolkien's work, and how I think we're all agreed has been translated pretty darn well into the rules of Adventures in Middle-earth. Certainly provided some pretty big character moments for us, and imagine it continue to do so. And Torwald, being a specialist in shadow lore, will likely be at the heart of some of those moments to come. So thank you for joining us, James.
Thank you for having me.
no emails except on party business. And comment suggestions and questions to thefellowshipphase@gmail.com. The long year turns to its close. Much we have accomplished these last seasons. Our fellowship disbands, but is not broken, and we will return
on the next episode of The Fellowship Phase.